Welcome, I'm Ron DeSantis. I'm running for Congress in Florida's 6th District. Many of you have told me that you feel that the country is really losing a lot of what makes us exceptional. We seem to be walking away from some of the principles on which we were founded and some of the principles that have made us great. And I certainly believe that, and that's why I'm running. Obviously, it's important that we defeat Barack Obama in November. I think he's taken the country in the wrong direction. I think he's an impediment to the type of bold reforms that we need to save our country from fiscal ruin. But at the same time, beating Obama just gives us a chance to get things right. It does not guarantee that we get things right. If we send Republicans up to Washington in the Congress who go native, who become part of the Washington establishment, who expand government and continue the spending binge, well, we'll have missed a historic opportunity to get our country back on track. Now, I'm not a politician. I'm an Iraq veteran. I'm a former prosecutor. I'm an officer in the Navy Reserve. I'm a citizen candidate running in the Reagan tradition. I want to do things in Washington. I don't want to be somebody. Too many politicians go up there trying to feather their own nests, trying to advance themselves personally, trying to maintain their power and perks of office. That's not me. I'm going to advance conservative principles because I think that's the only way we'll be able to get our country back on track. The first thing I would do in January of 2013 is vote for the full repeal of Obamacare. I don't think you're ever going to be able to fix the budget deficit, to fix our problem with our national debt, if you impose this new 2,500-page bill on top of our already existing problems. I would also move swiftly to deal with Dodd-Frank, which I think is also going to be a disaster, and it's already hurting small and community banks throughout the country. And then I think we really got to get serious about reducing spending and reducing the size and scope of the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy has been untethered from accountability, and we see agencies like HHS and EPA exercising legislative authority, and that's not really consistent with constitutional government. I also think we need to reform the system in which members of Congress operate. Members of Congress have to be accountable under the very same laws that apply to us. Too many members live under their own set of rules, and that's wrong. So I've already pledged I will not take a taxpayer-financed congressional pension. I don't think it's right that someone like Barney Frank would leave Congress after having done a lot of damage to the country with a better pension than many people who serve in the military and risk their lives on behalf of the country. I also think we need term limits for members of Congress. People there 30, 40 years are not going to be change agents. They're going to continue the system the way it is. And so I think if we institute term limits, we could force some change and get some new blood in Congress. I also think members of Congress should be paid per performance. Right now, the Senate has not passed a budget in over 1,000 days, and the consequences are nothing. They just continue to not do their job. I think if you or I failed to do our job in the real world, we would face some serious consequences pretty quickly. So I propose very simple rules. If you do not pass a budget on time, that's your prerogative, but your pay will stop until you do pass a budget. I also think congressional pay should be tied to increases in the national debt, such that if you increase the national debt by, say, 5%, well, then the pay automatically goes down by 5%. Too many politicians are not personally affected by the decisions they make, and it's always politically more convenient to pass the buck to future generations rather than to make the tough decisions we need to make to save our country. So I'm proud to be running. I think I can be a conservative reformer. I think I can be a leader in Congress. And I'm mindful of Benjamin Franklin's admonition when he walked out of the Constitutional Convention in 1787. He was asked by a woman, "What kind of a government have you given us, Dr. Franklin, a republic or a monarchy?" He said, "It was a republic, ma'am, if you could keep it." And I think 2012 is one of those critical junctures in our history where if you believe in constitutionally limited government, if you believe the purpose of our society is to preserve and protect individual liberty, if you believe in the importance of abiding by the rule of law, then you really need to stand up and make your voice heard. I'm doing that as a candidate for Congress, and I'd like to have your support on August 14th.
Thank you very much.
Silence this phone. I thought I had done it. It's
That's all right. Just say thank you, Mr. President. Let me start with this. I found this very interesting. You've been endorsed by Club for Growth, Koch brothers, a group supported by them, Senator Lee, a very, very conservative, Phyllis Schlafly. Well, I'm one of the few people who's actually been to our house, which is a beautiful house, incidentally. And Jim Ryan, who is very, very conservative. Can you talk for just a second about what your philosophy is? Because these are one, small government, anti-tax, and then a social conservative. And they usually aren't happy together. Usually they're in separate camps. You seem to be in every camp.
Well, I think that's right. I think I've really been able to unite the conservative movement. I think if you look at the different strands of our movement, you have a national security branch, which I think is best represented by Reagan's philosophy of peace through strength. So you look at someone like an Ambassador Bolton, who's supporting me. And then you look at small government, free market, constitutional government, basically. And I think that really is where Republicans have failed recently. I mean, we have been expanding government and spending. And so you've got to be fiscally conservative. If you don't do that, then the Republican Party really doesn't have a rationale to exist. And I think I've been somebody who's laid out principles about what the federal government should do, what it shouldn't do. And so you look at like Club for Growth and Freedom Works, I think they really appreciate that. And then in terms of kind of social conservatism, you look at an issue like being pro-life or something. For me, I believe what the founding fathers believed, that we're endowed by God with certain inalienable rights, including the right to life. And so that's just something that flows naturally from me and kind of my worldview. And so I think people appreciate, particularly a younger guy like me, kind of understanding that insight and being able to articulate it. And so someone like a Phyllis Schlafly, I think, was happy to support somebody like me.
It seems to me to be an odd marriage. I mean, libertarians, believe in really sort of government out of your life. Social conservatives, it's really hard to get a bigger government than a government that's in your womb. And that's why there's been sort of a tension between those two camps. Intellectually, I'm having a hard time getting my arms around how Charles Koch views you supported Phyllis Schlafly, and they really don't have that much in common. One is looking for a very big government. You can't get a bigger government.
Well, I disagree with that entirely. I mean, for example, do you think taxpayer dollars should be going to fund Planned Parenthood, which funds abortion? I don't. So if you're in favor of that, you're in favor of the bigger government, not me. I'm in favor of less government. I'm in favor of government getting out of that business. I'm in favor of not mandating Catholic hospitals provide services that relate to abortion. I don't think the government should be ordering them to do that. I think they should be able to act in a free and just way. So I just disagree. I think a lot of times I'm advocating less government. I mean, if you're going to talk about just what the Constitution provides in terms of the right to life, I mean, I don't think anybody who can make an argument with a straight face that the 14th Amendment was meant to mandate abortion on demand. It had nothing to do with why they ratified it. And so if you look at something like Roe versus Wade, I mean, that was a huge reach in terms of judicial activism. I mean, you had Byron White was appointed by Jack Kennedy, said it was an exercise of raw judicial power. And so I basically said that the Constitution leaves the matter of abortion to the states. I mean, that's how the Constitution is. Now, if you want to talk about adding some type of constitutional protection for life, I mean, I've always been open to that. But that it was elevated to the federal government by a liberal court, not by people like me. And I think you look at somebody like Ron Paul. I mean, he's the most prominent libertarian in the country today, and he's somebody who's pro-life. And it's just because, if you believe your right to life is inalienable, then that means that other people don't have the ability, to take that away. So I think pretty much I'll be somebody who's going to have a less intrusive, smaller government. I will not have the government funding abortion. I will not have the government ordering institutions to support abortion, and I will allow different individuals to make decisions about what type of services they're providing along those lines.
Have you signed a no tax pledge, or will you?
Yeah, I have signed one, and the reason is simple. I'm very skeptical of this notion that somehow you just need to kind of raise taxes and this and that for two reasons. One, I mean, our economy is growing at 1.8%. I mean, if we continue growing where we're growing now, you're never going to fix the budget problem, and you're not going to really be able to fix the unemployment problem, because there's just not going to be enough jobs if we're growing at this rate. So I want pro-growth policies, and I think higher taxes are not going to be conducive to to a growing economy. But second, Congress is not a rational actor. I mean, put aside the economic disincentives that higher taxes provide, which I think are real. I think they hurt growth. I mean, even if you concede for a minute that you're going to get a gusher of new revenue because you're raising taxes, Congress is not like a normal person. I mean, if you're in debt, you get some new money, maybe work another job, you're going to take that, you're going to start paying off your debts. It's not what Congress does. They see a new stream of revenue, and then they start spending on additional programs. And so what you end up having is the higher taxes, rather than alleviating the problem, actually fuel bigger and bigger government. So you're always trying to chase higher levels of spending with higher levels of taxation. And I think the end of the day, the end result is economic stagnation. And I don't think you deal with the budget deficit. I mean, you were asked about, would you take 10 spending cuts for every $1 in tax increases? And to me, it's kind of like, a flying unicorn. It's like no proposal has ever been put out where you would actually cut spending. It's always raise taxes now, and then we'll cut spending down the line. The problem with that is you can't bind a successive Congress. I mean, you can cut spending in your Congress, and then you can have a successive election, and that Congress can spend whatever it wants to. I cannot bind Congresses 3 years from now, and so you need to get busy with structural reform of the government, of spending, and reducing spending, and I think that's the only way that you have a chance to really do it. I don't think higher taxes would help it. I think it would actually hurt it.
Okay. You gave the example of 10 spending cuts and $10 in spending cuts and $1 new taxes. That was brought up by Governor Jeb Bush. He's the one that brought that example up. No one's doubting he's a conservative, but his argument is that you can't negotiate with the other side if you go in and already take everything off the table. So, and his other argument is you're going to have gridlock if you make it so that you can't talk to the other side. And we are a divided nation. You went to college in New England. There aren't many Republicans up there who think the way you do. There aren't many Democrats down here who think the way they do up there. We are a divided country. How are we going to be able to talk to the other side if you automatically dismiss issues that they may want to bring to the table?
Well, I mean,
revenue, all revenue enhancements or tax increase, whatever.
Well, look, I'm not opposed. So I'm opposed to tax increases. You can get more revenue by enacting pro-growth tax reform. So you're going to be lowering rates, but you'll be broadening the base. And I think there are ways that you can do that would be consistent with a limited government conservative philosophy. But I mean, talk about taking things off the table. I mean, you had this Simpson-Bowles plan that comes out. And it involves, some tax hikes, spending cuts, all this stuff, and it was tilted more towards spending cuts, but it didn't deal with Obamacare. They said Obamacare is off the table. So why can they put Obamacare off the table, but then I can't put taxes off the table? I mean, to me, it doesn't make sense. Obamacare, they said it would cost $800 billion over 10 years. We know it's now going to be at a minimum $1.75 trillion. And probably that's a floor, not a ceiling. Health programs are always more expensive than what they're advertised. When Britain did the National Health Service, they were 50% under what it actually was in the first year alone. And if you look at what Medicare was forecast to be, I mean, it's been way more expensive than what it was initially. Lyndon Johnson said if it cost more than $500 million a year, that he would have hell to pay. Well, I mean, it's $500 billion a year now, and I know bells and whistles have been added to it since then, but it's just, you have to look at Obamacare and understand what's going on there. They are not willing to deal with Obamacare at all, and so to me, it's all moot if you're not willing to do it. And, you talk about reaching accommodation with the other side. Look, I don't know if you can reach accommodation on something like Obamacare. I mean, the public never wanted it. It was opposed from pretty much day one. It's had a majority of people against it the whole time. Obama knew this, Pelosi knew this, Reid knew this, yet they kept going, The result was an unseemly process, a 2,500-page bill that not a single one of them read, imposed on the American people. That was not something that the other side wanted to do. And so my view is I don't know that you're going to be able to compromise on that. I think that's what this election's about. And I think the people should choose what they want. If you want Obamacare, re-elect Obama. If you don't, try a new president, try people like me in the Congress, and let us do what we say we're going to do, and we'll see what ends up happening, to fix the country. But I think also the history of kind of these, like you look at Reagan's 82 deal where he did agree to some tax increases, not marginal rate increases on income taxes, but other tax fees. He never really got any of the spending cuts that were promised. He actually had more revenue in the 80s but spending just kept going up, and part of that was a defense buildup. But if you look at the domestic budget, that increased too, and those spending cuts never materialized. So it's just my belief that when you take taxes off the table, that's the only way you can force an honest debate about spending. Otherwise, we're just going to continue spending money that we don't have. And so that's just based on historical experience. What I've said, I think the 1990 tax deal also vindicates that. That was 1990. You still had $200+ billion deficits as you got into 94. It wasn't as if they solved the problem. The only reason we even had kind of these temporary surpluses was because you had divided government with Gingrich and Clinton, and then you had a tech bubble which was spitting off revenues faster than Congress could spend it. If they knew how much revenue was going to come in, you probably would have never even had a balanced budget because they probably would have spent it. And so I just think that we're on an unsustainable course. We're spending 25% of GDP, and we have got to bend that downward. And so that's going to be my focus.
Okay, I'm sure you've been reading this a lot being written in the national press, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and others are saying that there needs to be a grain compromise. There needs to be, both sides need to give. Both sides are very worried about what will happen if the so-called tax cliff at the end of the year, if the Bush tax cuts are not extended. And people on both sides are saying we'll go into a recession, perhaps even a depression if that happens. And I'm sure you read the article in the New York Times today that what the Democrats are proposing. If you're elected, you'll be there when this comes up. And what they're proposing is to let all the tax cuts, the Bush tax cuts, go away, and then when the Congress resumes, just start to vote specific tax cuts. They're saying it would be cover for the Republicans because they'd be cutting taxes. But they wouldn't do it for the higher income people. What do you think about that as a tactic? It's hardball, but it's
hardball, but I think it's disastrous policy. I mean, part of the problem with our economy now is that people don't have certainty about what the law is going to be. James Madison in the Federalist paper said, "What prudent merchant would hazard his fortune if he knows not what he's doing is going to be legal in 1 year?" And I think we're really running into that, where we have temporary tax laws, we have an extremely uncertain regulatory environment. And I mean, it may even be, it's probably too late to alleviate that for next year because people don't know at this point. But I don't think that that's the right way to go, to allow the rates to shoot up and then turn around and try to shoot them back down with legislation. It just doesn't make sense to me. I mean, if you're serious, if you believe that we need to keep spending the way we are, like Obama and the Democrats believe, then they need to step up and realize that you're going to get much more revenue. And I'm not supporting. I would make the Bush rates permanent. But the bulk of that revenue you would get would come from people under $250,000 a year. I mean, it's not even close in terms of that, because there's just so many more taxpayers who fall into that, and the rates were cut. I mean, they dropped the bottom rate from 15 to 10%. That's a 33% rate cut. The top people didn't get nearly that much. They got 39.5 to 35% as a percentage of what they were paying. That's much lower. So that would be a very stiff tax increase in terms of the percentage that they're doing. But if they're going to be serious about this and they want to continue spending, they want to fund Obamacare, they want to do more of these things, cap and trade, you just physically can't just take it off people making over $250,000 a year. It's just, there's not enough income there to be able to satisfy all this. So it's just interesting to see, what their plan is, because doing the Buffett rule and doing some of these other things, that is not enough to get you, where you need to go. So if I'm presented so basically all this is going to happen before I'm there. If I come in January 3rd, the rates have reverted to what the Clinton era rates were, I would take that opportunity to do some tax reform and get some more pro-growth rates there and get the economy going, because that's ultimately what we need to do. Everything we're talking about is moot if we continue to grow under 2%.
Okay. If you cut spending, you're going to if you cut revenue, you're going to have to cut spending. And the big Pac-Man in the budget are Social Security and Medicare. What do you propose to do with those, sir?
While I would not change Social Security and Medicare for people who are on the program or are near retirement at 55 and over, just because I think that there's settled expectations there, particularly for people who are actually on it now. They've basically planned their life around that, so I wouldn't make changes along those lines. But what I think we need to do for people in my generation particularly is start to restructure the program in a way that's going to be financially sustainable, both Social Security and Medicare. I think the cost issue with Medicare is that there's no sensitivity to price. I mean, you basically go in, it's kind of an open-ended entitlement, things are paid for, and I would want me kind of as a younger guy, to know that, okay, you're going to have, Medicare, but then I think I should have to also provide for myself in certain respects, and if I want kind of a really grand policy, then I should be contributing to that and over and above, what Medicare has, because right now Medicare really goes up more than Social Security does even. And so I think if we reformed it for people in my generation, you wouldn't see probably any savings immediately in the budget, but I think the long-term picture would then improve dramatically. And I think that's important, because if you're talking about a debt crisis or something, I mean, it's not just what you're doing right now, but it's also people are going to look to see what's going on in the future, and that's where it really gets bad for us. So I would embrace proposals, like Paul Ryan offered and other people have offered, that are going to provide some market forces in there, more consumer choice, and make it so that it's not just basically a system that's gonna be bankrupt when you have new people coming into it. Social Security, I would do the same thing. Social Security is actually not as bad as Medicare, in the sense that it had been running surpluses for a long time. Now it's running a deficit, so there's nothing left in Social Security. It's guys like me pay into it, and then the people who are on Social Security, the check immediately goes out to them. We're now taking in less than the checks are going out, and so that problem is going to get worse. But I think for people in my generation, my life expectancy, and again, I wouldn't change it for people who are on it now, but my life expectancy is it's improved. I was born in 78, and it's probably improved 5 or 6 years just on average. That tends to annoy people when I tell them I'm going to be around for a few more years longer, but it's true. And so, me getting Social Security at 65 or 67, if I'm going to live, into my 80s, is probably not sustainable. When Social Security was created, the age that you received the benefit was actually higher than the life expectancy was, and so it was kind of a can't-lose system from the government's perspective. They taxed everyone 1%, and a lot of people didn't end up getting anything. And I don't know if that was just the way because they wanted it to eventually evolve in the way it is now, but the system was not originally designed for people to be on it for 30 years. So we just have to understand that it's a mathematical problem, and to allow people like me who have a lot longer to go to be able to to make some changes for us. So I would favor that.
You're going to live a long time if you keep doing what you did in my neighborhood, which was run around.
There you go. That's
right. Paul Ryan model, you talked about market forces. What David Brooks, who's a big fan of it, says basically what it is the consumer has more skin in the game. It's going to cost the consumer more money. Brooks is arguing that what Ryan has done is having an honest debate about it. It's going to cost you more money, but no one else seems to be talking about that. Candidates don't want to go there. But do you buy that premise that David Brooks has, that his interpretation of the Ryan plan is that basically it's going to lower costs because people will have to pay more if they seek more?
Yeah, not necessarily. I think people who are low income will probably be given coverage that is similar to what they have now. And I think people like me who've been more successful, it's not even that I will have to pay more. I will have a premium support that's going to guarantee me a certain amount of coverage. If you want something over and above that, if you want a Cadillac plan or something, then I do think it should be driven by the consumer rather than imposed on the taxpayers. And I just think that makes sense. But it also brings up the point. When you talk about healthcare costs, we have, and I don't pretend that I have a magic bullet for this, but you don't have consumer choice, you don't have prices, you have third parties paying for what goes on with healthcare. And so when I go into the doctor, I don't know whatever I'm doing, how much it costs or anything. I have my insurance, they pay for it, and that's the way it is. And I would like to see us move in a direction where there's a little bit more transparency in the healthcare system in terms of how much things cost. Because I think ideally, I go in for a physical, I go in for whatever routine checkups, all this stuff, I could pay out of pocket for that, and then you insure yourself against the really serious illnesses and things of that nature. If you did that, I think you would see costs be much lower than they are now. But the way it is now, you have incentives essentially to pass costs on to other people, and it just it's not good for restraining costs.
Okay. I suspect you're familiar with Gerald Sieb, who I always point out is a Kansan, likes to be a Kansan. And he's talked about in this article, which you may have read, yesterday's papers, he was quoting Democratic and Republican leaders saying that they have a window at the beginning of next year to come to what he called a grand compromise, a grand bargain, is his word. And so I'm going to go over 4 of these things with you and ask you what you think. He said in corporate taxes that Democrats need to accept the need for a simpler tax code and a lower corporate rate, and the Republicans need to eliminate eliminate loopholes to make this lower tax revenue neutral to avoid adding to the deficit. Obviously, the biggest loophole that people have is the home mortgage deduction. Would you be in favor of reviewing some of those loopholes, especially the ones that are immensely popular, like the home mortgage deduction?
Okay, but yeah, you said corporate tax rate, that would not apply to that. You're saying on the personal income tax rate to home mortgage deduction, right? Okay. Mm-hmm. You mentioned the corporate rate. I think that just from a matter of competition, I think our corporate rate is too high. I think that the notion that somehow we're sticking it to corporations, it's somewhat of a fallacy because they pass those costs on to consumers a lot of times anyways. So I would definitely be in favor of lowering the business tax. And I have no problem with flattening the code in that respect, because I think we have way too many little preferences in the tax code. So you're looking at a dramatically lower corporate rate. You can get rid of some of the clutter in the tax code, and I think you're going to end up being better off. In terms of the personal income tax, I would not take away anybody's home mortgage deduction that already has it, because I think that they've had kind of settled expectations. What I've proposed or what I've embraced are really bold tax reform proposals, like a flat tax, for example. But what I would do is give you the option, if you like your own home interest deduction or whatnot, you're grandfathered in, and you can continue to use that and file under the old system. I just think that when people make big decisions in their lives like that, I don't want to just kind of yank the rug from under them. But I think if you look at our housing policy over the past 30 years, has been a failure from Washington, and that I think we've over-incentivized housing. The tax is part of that, but also I think Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, I think FHA, I think a lot of the regulations that were imposed in terms of getting easy money out there were that. But I'm in favor of lower rates and getting rid of loopholes, stop having the government try to shape behavior as a general matter, but I would just allow existing taxpayers to continue, if they so chose, to keep what they had.
Balancing the budget, they're arguing that Democrats need to accept meaningful reductions in Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, and the Republicans need to agree to selected tax increases. Sort of a tough one, but that's what the leadership, according to Gerald Sieb, highly respected, is saying that both parties have to make some compromises. Can you imagine any situation where you would support a tax increase if it was part of the so-called grand bargain?
Well, the problem with the grand bargain is, like Social Security, we went through this, a couple decades ago, where we had a big grand bargain in '83 with Reagan and Tip O'Neill, and it may have pushed the can down the road a little bit, but we're kind of still here. I think the taxes, Social Security, that tax when it started was 1%. Now your payroll tax is 15.4% because the employer's share you would make that money. I mean, that's part of what they're compensating you. So, 15.4% is going to these programs. And Medicare, that applies to every single dollar you earn. So you have people who are very high income, who may make $5-10 million a year. I mean, they're paying that 2.9% employer-employee combined on every single dollar. Just 1 year of taxes is probably more than you'll ever get out of the system. So I mean, those are some stiff taxes, and it applies to people who are low income. So I just don't know about raising payroll. I can tell you, I would not favor raising payroll taxes. I mean, I just think that it's high enough. I mean, at some point, you work to be able to have income, to be able to do what you want with it. It's not just to make the government solvent. And I think I would rather have the government live within the means that it has, rather than have us continuing to pony up more and more when we continue to find ourselves in fiscal problems, as the time goes by.
Okay.
Margaret?
Talk about this issue with states over not getting enough money back, or getting money back with too many strings on it, like road money, education money. Where do you stand on those issues?
My favorite, devolving authority to states on those issues. For example, with the highway spending, there's a bill in Congress that phases in a different way of dealing with the gas tax, such because right now what we have is you send all this transportation tax money to Washington, so Florida sends it, everyone else sends it, and then these guys are up there like pigs at the trough trying to get as much as they can for their states to just bring it back. And so what the bill would do, the idea is, okay, allow states to simply keep a lot of this money, and then states can meet the needs of what they're doing for their citizens. And I think that's better, because when it goes up to Washington, we've really lost sight of any limitations on what's a proper object of federal spending. Nancy Pelosi, some of these earmarks with some aquarium in San Francisco, that is not a federal issue at all. You should never spend $1 on something like that. So if you keep it with the states, well, then states can make a better determination about how they spend it, rather than just have whoever has the most power bring that back to their district and spend it on other things. So I would want to devolve that to the states. I think we'd be much better off if we did that. And then the same thing with education. I've had some Republicans come up to me and say, I'm not a fan of Obama, but this race to the top, he did give some money for this or that. And my view on that is be careful what you wish for, because that money is not going to be free. What it's going to do is people are going to depend on it, and they're going to get used to it, and then the federal government is going to require certain behavior as a result of that. I mean, I think George Bush supported No Child Left Behind, federal standards on local schools. I oppose that. I would repeal that. I think it was the wrong approach. I think we need to keep education at the local level, not bring it up to Washington. I mean, we've had federal involvement in education for decades now. Our education is not improved as a result of it. And I just think we need to understand that, and understand that our states are laboratories of democracy. Allow them to experiment with different approaches in education, and I think we'll be able to see what works much better than having the federal government think it can impose standards on local schools.
Well, No Child Left Behind was kind of one size fits all.
Without question, and it's frustrated a lot of teachers and school administrators, and I'm in agreement on that. I mean, the federal government, Madison said, its powers are few and defined, and so we've gotten to this situation where we think every answer to every question there could be something that the federal government can do, and I think that's wrong as a matter of constitutional basics, but it's also wrong as a matter of just basic prudence, because when you take on all these different things, then what you do, you don't end up doing much of it very well. And so I think that's why our government, the federal government's chronically inept at a lot of the things it does, because it tries to get involved in all these other things. I think if it focused on its core missions, it would be much better. It would perform much better.
And you would end earmarks too.
I support a flat ban on earmarks. Absolutely. I think they're corrupting. I think they facilitate bigger spending, and to take those outside of a proper appropriations process is just not right, and it's not, and most of those earmarks are not really consistent with Congress's power to spend for, you can only spend if it's a general welfare. You can't just spend on anything you want under Article 1, Section 8. And I think a lot of those earmarks don't even meet that constitutional test if you look at some of the ridiculous things that have been funded with them.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Hey, let me ask you a question. John Mikers is leaving this district, as is obvious. He's widely respected here. What would you seek to emulate that John has done? What would you seek to emulate when you go to Washington?
Well, I mean, I think, you raised John because of the earmarks. Were obviously different on the earmarks. I mean, he has supported earmarks in the past, and I don't, and I think I would obviously, part company with him on that. I think he's been somebody who's been strong on Second Amendment issues, which I very much appreciate. I think he's been somebody who's been supportive of our military, which is very important to me. I mean, you look at where this president wants to find cuts, and he wants to give all these people all these different benefits, people who are going to vote for him. And the place he goes to try to find cuts is things like TRICARE, where these people are earning that benefit, which just doesn't compute well with me. And so I think Congressman Micah has been a friend to the military. And I think he's also been somebody who has been, who has, at least recently, I've seen him on Fox News a lot more now because he's got a competitive race. And I think I agree with his opposition to the TSA bureaucracy and some of the other bureaucracies that have really gotten out of control. And that is something that, when we talk about reducing government, a lot of times we only focus on spending, and spending is very important, but you also got to reduce the power and influence of the bureaucracy, because it's grown beyond its original mandate in many different instances, and it's exercising way too much power over us. And of course, the bureaucracy is not accountable, and I think he's recognized that, and that would be something that I would agree with.
And other than earmarks, where would you disagree? What would you do differently?
Well, I think if you look at his voting record, I think he's been generally conservative, but I think I would certainly be somebody, fairly or unfairly, he's viewed as more of an establishment Republican, and whether you agree with that or not, but I don't think anyone, when I go up there, would consider me to be part of the establishment. I think they're going to say this guy's a conservative reformer, and I'm going to take on members of both parties, because, and I'll take on our president if Romney gets elected when they're wrong, because I just think that we've had chances in 2000, 2001, 2005, and we didn't really capitalize on them. And so I think now you've got to be willing to buck leaders and to do what you think is right. I think there's a critical mass of people in the Congress who agree with me on that, and so we may end up on some of those tough votes that really separate somebody who's generally conservative from somebody who's really trying to limit government. You may see a distinction there.
You speak of term limits. Could you expand your views on term limits and what they should be?
I support term limits. I think that the Founding Fathers debated it. They called it rotation in office, and they eventually decided against it, partially because, especially once they moved the capital to Washington, people wouldn't want to be in Washington for 40 years at that time. It was a swamp. There just wasn't much going on. It was a major burden and a major sacrifice to do that. And so I don't think that they really conceived of this becoming a professional class of politicians the way it has. People say, oh, well, you have term limits, you can just vote them out. The fact of the matter is 80% of the congressional districts in this country are one party or another. Charlie Rangel's district is going to elect a Democrat every single time. There are districts that are going to elect a Republican every single time. So the only way you can possibly dislodge an incumbent is in a primary. Our system is rigged to basically benefit incumbents in terms of campaign finance, in terms of other ways that they can use the perks of office. So it's very difficult to mount a meaningful primary against an entrenched incumbent. If you're somebody like Dick Lugar, who hasn't even lived in his state for 20 years and has kind of gotten out of step, and he's been there 36 years, well, then you may be able to do it. But the typical incumbent is very tough. So that's why I think you need term limits to force change, to force new blood, and to get out of this mentality of going to Congress to be your career rather than going kind of as a temporary servant. What I've proposed, and I think this is the only way you'll be able to do it, because Congress will not vote to limit themselves voluntarily, and you do need a constitutional amendment given how the Supreme Court's come out on this. You need 2/3 of Congress. So I would say term limits, I'm 2 terms in the Senate for sure. I'm flexible in the House, anywhere from 3 to 6. And you have to grandfather in the people who are there now, because I think they'd be willing to limit other people. I just don't think they will limit themselves. So basically my argument will be, and I think we could get a lot of Republicans for sure, is basically like, look, 80% of the public wants this. It's not going to affect you. And then what will happen is, you may have somebody like a Barney Frank. I mean, I know he's retiring, but if he stayed for the 10 years, that he would be allowed to do that under the amendment. But then what would happen is once he left, then the next person that came in, the limit would attach to them. So that's the only way realistically you could do it is through the grandfather process. So that's what I'm going to try to do. And I think I've not found one person yet who opposes term limits. I know there are some, but when you really get into the discussion about do you have a meaningful choice, I just don't think you do in too many of our elections.
The argument against term limits is that it empowers the bureaucracy because you don't have people aren't there long enough to understand the complexity of government and being able to drill down. No matter how bright you are, the first term in Congress, you're going to be trying to figure out what's going on, as is every other freshman. And so the argument is that if you're only there for 8 or 10 years, and it takes you half that time to understand the bureaucracy, you're empowering the bureaucrats who will have the knowledge that the graybeards, because they're no longer there, won't have.
Well, we've already done that, though. So, I mean, you don't have term limits now. We've empowered the bureaucracy beyond anything the Founder Fathers would have imagined. If you look at, like, the EPA ordering a family to tear down its house under penalty of $35,000 a day, gets slapped down by the Supreme Court, 9-0. I mean, when you get Stephen Breyer and Ruth Ginsburg telling you you've gone too far as a bureaucrat, you're really off too far. I mean, they live for this stuff. That's what drives them, is to create a bureaucracy. So that is. So I mean, I think we're already there, and I think my rejoinder to that would be a lot of people who've been there for 30 years say, well, this is how it is. This is how it's done, and they become accustomed to how it is. Whereas when you get new reformers that come in, we'll look at it, and yeah, I mean. You got to study up and you got to be smart about it, but we're more likely to question why things are done the way they're doing it, because people are going to say to me, well, this is how we do it up here. And my initial reaction is going to be, well, I understand that, but I mean, what you're doing isn't working. I mean, we really need to start looking at some of these things in a different light. I don't know that you're going to have a majority of the Congress who agrees with me on that, but I think you're going to have a critical mass of the Republican caucus that agrees with me on that, and that's really what you need to force change. So I think I'm in favor of it.
Joe.
I just wanted to ask about the military. This is a big military area.
Absolutely.
And you've served in Afghanistan.
Iraq,
I'm sorry. And the mood seems to be to downsize the military, downsize the National Guard. Where do you stand on that? At what point are we going to get to enough is enough downsizing?
Well, I think we're there. I think if you look at the Navy, we think we can continue to downsize the Navy, and people will look at it and they'll say, the Navy, we haven't had a naval war in decades. Why do we need, to have this fleet? Well, the reason we haven't had a naval war in decades is because we have that fleet. I mean, we have such superiority in the blue water that these other nations have not been able to confront us there. So it's worked to deter threats on the high seas. I think you see China and Russia, they're going to be more aggressive on the sea, and so I think we need to continue to have a strong Navy. If you look at what Obama's planning for the Marine Corps, I mean, it's a decimation of the Marine Corps. I think that's just so short-sighted. The national defense is the preeminent function of the federal government. Trust me, I want to spend as least amount of money as possible to defend us. I mean, if we satisfy the defense mission spending this amount, I don't want to go a penny over that. I mean, of course, but I think the mission needs to be honored, and what you'll find is if you just do what needs to be done, John Jay in the Federalist paper said the best way to secure your country is to have the best possible state of defense, because it will deter people who would otherwise want to challenge you. If you do that and you are successfully deterring threats and dealing with threats as they come, such as certain terrorist groups, you're going to spend less money in the long term, because if we're inviting threats, it's much more expensive to have to fight these people all the time than to just deter them from wanting to mess with us in the first place. And so then it just in terms of some of these benefits, I mean, I mentioned TRICARE. I mean, my thing is and I hear Republicans will say to me, 50% of Americans get some type of government check or whatever. And yeah, I mean, there's a truth to that, but I'm sorry, I draw a huge distinction between somebody who's taking an EBT card to go buy junk food at a store, and a retired gunnery sergeant who's done multiple combat tours in Iraq and is getting a disability pension. I mean, he earned that pension. The other person is getting basically a handout from the government, I think abusing it by buying junk food. So just because you're getting something from the U.S. government does not necessarily mean that it's somehow a handout. The people in the military have earned those benefits, and those are benefits that I would want to definitely make sure that are preserved.
Let me ask about your views. One of the more difficult topics under discussion now is immigration. The various states are taking their own ways of dealing with it. The federal government has its way of dealing with it. I don't think anyone will disagree that it's a mess. Where do you think the country should go on immigration reform? What would you support?
Well, I oppose what Barack Obama has done recently by essentially announcing that he's just not going to enforce the law against a class of 1 million different people. I think that violates Article 2, Section 3 that requires the president to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. You're not faithfully executing the law if you're just choosing to ignore it against a class of people that large. I mean, there's obviously executive discretion anytime you prosecute the law. That's just second nature. But it's not faithful to just say you're not going to do it. So I think that was wrong. And it brings up a problem that's immigration, but also other of, he submitted the DREAM Act to Congress, just like he submitted cap and trade. So you submit this to Congress, they look at it, they don't vote the way you want. And so normally that's supposed to mean you lost and you got to try again. Well, he just says, okay, we didn't get it through Congress, we'll just do it through the bureaucracy anyways. So it's almost like, what are we doing here? Are we just going through the motions by debating legislation and stuff? He's just going to go do it through the bureaucracy. So I think that was a major affront to the rule of law. I definitely oppose that. My approach is basically attrition through enforcement. In some instances, this administration, once you get into deportation proceedings, it doesn't matter. I mean, you basically are never actually deported. And if you don't enforce the law, then you're going to continue to draw people to come here. Because a lot of people know if they just get across the border, they're probably going to be able to stay. And so I would want to ramp up enforcement of the law. That doesn't mean you're going to go and actually round up people at once, but what it means is as they come into contact with the law is enforced as it's written, and then I think it provides a deterrent for people coming in the future. I also think that I oppose any type of amnesty or citizenship for people who've come here illegally, because you got a lot of people who go through a very cumbersome legal immigration process. And to kind of allow someone who's come here illegally to get citizenship without going through the proper process, to me, is just putting a thumb in their eye. Those people who go through the process legally, a lot of those people, they really want to come to America because they believe in what America is all about. And so those people are the ones that you got to do right by, and so I think it's unfair if you start talking about some type of amnesty or citizenship for people here illegally. So I'm opposed to that. I'm also opposed to, look, if you think illegal immigration is a problem, which I think most people do, certainly Republicans, that I talk to, they all believe that. You can't structure incentives to have more illegal immigration. For example, I would oppose giving in-state tuition to children of illegal immigrants. Not because I don't want people to get educated, but it's like, okay, if you believe that illegal immigration is a problem, why would you give an illegal immigrant family a better deal than you're giving American citizens in 49 other states? It doesn't make sense that you would do that. And so I would, and that's probably more of a state issue, but I would not support that. And I support Arizona's right to enforce federal law. This happens all the time. When I was at the U.S. Attorney's Office, we had the Jacksonville Sheriff. I prosecuted a case. There was a guy who lived by Cecil Field, or no, not Cecil Field, White House Field. And when they would do the carrier landings and the thing there, he didn't like it because it was so loud, and he had his mobile home right there. So he bought a 10 million candle power spotlight, and he would blind the pilots as they came to land. So we prosecuted him for interference with air navigation, but it was the local JSO who responded, who did the report or anything, and then they provided it to us. So they were the ones who pursued it. It was a federal case from the beginning, but they were able to, to enforce that law and give it to us. And so that's what that happens all the time. So basically, what Arizona is saying is, hey, if you're already involved in breaking the law, or you're suspected, you're stopped, or whatever, and you can't produce identification, you give us some reason to think you may be here illegally, we can ask you about it, and then if you are here illegally, all we do is report it to the feds. I mean, that's all they're doing. Obama doesn't want that because he doesn't want to then have to follow through and enforce the law. And so I think that's a problem.
Let me ask, as we're getting close to the end here, crowded field in this race, obviously. Many of the viewpoints that I've heard from some of your opponents are very similar to yours. Could you explain why you think that you would be the better candidate?
Sure. Well, I think there's a number of reasons. I mean, I'm somebody who is a conservative reformer. I think the rest of the candidates in the race would be pretty standard issue establishment Republicans. They'd be very similar to the type of people you tend to see up there. I would be somebody who would be different. I think you see that I've been recognized nationally as being somebody who would be different, who would be a leader, who could be somebody like a Paul Ryan very quickly. I mean, when you have people saying that I have a deeper understanding of our nation's founders and founding documents than almost anyone currently in Congress now, I think that's bringing a level of knowledge and sophistication that's going to be much greater than somebody who has just served in some local office or had done some other things. I think we do need new blood in the system. I think we need people who are committed to bold conservative colors, not pale establishment pastels, and that's what I represent. And I also, just in terms of experience, even though I haven't been a politician, I'm the only guy with any experience in the war on terrorism, both in Iraq and at the Guantanamo Bay detention facility. I'm the only person that has any type of familiarity with the major constitutional issues that have faced the country over the past few years, not only through my book, but just in terms of what I've done in my career. And so I think that's very, very important, to have somebody who is ready to play at the top level from day one in the Congress.
Ron, we appreciate you being with us today, and we'll allow you to close the meeting if you have anything else to share.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. And I would just say that, we really need to seize the moment in January of 2013. I think it'll be a very important time to see whether we're really serious about doing what we tend to say we're going to do. If we're able to defeat Barack Obama, which I think we can, and we can have a Republican Senate and a Republican House, we'll be given the task of trying to clean up some of the mess of the last 3 years, but also before that. And there's been messes created by both parties. And so I'll be somebody who will be tethered to conservative principles. My rudder is set as a Reagan conservative, and I think that's the only way that we can right the ship. So I'd ask for your support on August 14th. Thanks.
Very good. Thank you, sir.